Leetcode 56, merge intervals in JavaScript. This is an array problem with a fairly low degree of success, surprisingly. But it's not that hard once you understand how the algorithm works. Given an array of intervals where intervals I equals start I end I, merge all overlapping intervals and return an array of non-overlapping intervals that cover all the intervals in the input. Well, an interval is the subarray here. So we have an array of intervals. There's interval 1, 1, 3, interval 2, 2, 6, 8, 10, and 15, 18. And we can see here that the end is the second number in the interval. So this is our first interval. 1 is the start, 3 is the end. So if we were to draw this out on a piece of paper, we'd have 1 and then 3. And then the next one, if we were to put below it, we'd have 2, somewhere in the middle of that line, and then 6. So 1 and 3 and 2 and 6 overlap because the end of the first interval overlaps the start of the second interval. And we don't see anything about how these are supposed to be in any sorted order. Right, in the input, the example that we're given, they are in order, and they're sorted according to the start. And that seems convenient, but that's not guaranteed to occur in the data that we get. Example 2, 1, 4, 4, 5. 4 is considered overlapping because the end of the first interval is greater than or equal to the start of the second. If we look on this chart, I have timelines drawn out. We have 1, 3, 4, 6, no overlap, so that gets passed through. There's no merging. The second one, 1, 3, 3, 6, the 3's overlap, and the second interval ends later, so it has a larger end. So we use the start of the first interval and the end of the second interval. In the third example, 1 and 3 and 1 and 4 have the same start, but the end is different. The end of the second one is 4. So then we merge those. So they do overlap. We'd have 1 and 4. Now, for the fourth example, 1 and 3 and 2 and 2. Now, we can have an interval with a 0 width. 1 and 3, 1 starts before the second interval. The second interval starts after the first interval's start. And the second interval's end ends before the first interval's end. So in this case, we just get rid of the second interval and use 1 and 3. We use the start from interval 1 and the end from interval 1. And we can see in the constraints on this problem here that the intervals, that 0 is less than or equal to start, end is greater than or equal to start. So they can overlap. They can be the same number. And then they both have to be less than 10 to the power of 4. But there are no negative intervals, right? So we don't have any negative interval, no negative time events, negative intervals. So looking at this, we can clearly see a strategy going on. The first thing we need to do is sort by the start. So if we're going to loop through these and find out if one interval in the loop has an end that's later than the other interval in the loop, the subsequent interval in our array, let's say the first one in the array is this one and the second array is this one, then we're going to have to sort by the start. Sort by the start, and that will guarantee that the first interval in the array, and then all the intervals in the array will be sorted according to start time. And so the second interval could be having the same start time as the first interval, and the third the same as the second, and so on. But if we sort them according to start time, that should be fine. And it's not going to be a problem as long as the second interval, the subsequent interval, doesn't start prior to the first interval start time. So now we only have to worry about the end of the first and the start of the second. Do they overlap? If they do, then we have to figure out which end do we use. The end of the start? Well, in this case, we don't use any. In this case, no, we would not use the end of the start. We would use the end of the first interval. We would use the end of the second interval, 6. In the third example, we would use the end of the second interval, 4. In the fourth example, we would use the end of the first interval. So all we have to do is pick between the larger of the two, the end and the start. And once we pick that number, we can just put that number into the end of the first interval. And we don't even have to know which one it came from. We just have to get the number. Which is greater, the number in the first interval or the number at the end of the second interval? And we take that number and we use that and add that to replace the value of the first interval's end. So then the first interval will be then 1 and 3, which it already was. Well, that's not a great example. Let's take the second one, the third example here. 1 and 3 versus 1 and 4. We would take 4 from our second interval, replace 3, and then get rid of the second interval. So 4 becomes the end of the first interval, and the interval of 1, 4 goes away. So I think it's pretty clear now what the strategy is to code this up. We're going to first sort based on the start, and then we're going to loop through comparing iteratively, each in order, which intervals overlap, and then once we've determined if there is an overlap, which end do we use, and then we delete the second of the two intervals that we have just compared. Okay, so let's get to coding right now. So we're going to modify the input array, and I'll say something about that in the end. But we're going to say intervals.sort A, B, and we're going to return A0 minus B0. Next, we're going to create a function. Merge intervals. I'm just going to modify the input for let I equal 0, I less than length, I plus plus, const L, I, that's the first interval. R equals intervals I plus 1. And I already have a mistake. And the mistake is we have to go 1 before the end. We can't include that end because we have that I plus 1. Some of you probably already caught it. Good job if you did. If the end of the first interval overlaps the start of the second interval, if L1 greater than or equal to R0, then we got to merge. L1 is now going to equal to not R1, but math.max R L1, sorry, R1. Then we're going to have to remove the second interval. And the way to do that is to say intervals dot splice I plus 1, where we start at, 1, how many we're going to remove from that intervals array. And the next thing we have to do is, since we removed 1 from the array, is decrement our I counter. So we're going to have to call merge intervals. And then we return the intervals. The problem with modifying the input array is if we were modifying this array that came from somewhere else, that could have surprising side effects on whoever called this method on us. So it's always a good consideration to, do you want to modify the input array or do you want to make a safe copy? Generally a good idea to make a safe copy in real world code. This is Leetcode, and we have to care about getting that all important performance metrics for memory and speed. So let's run this before we submit it, and we'll see if it worked. Okay, good, it's working. And when you submit it, and let's see what kind of performance we got. Not very good this time. But the previous one I just made, which I had a mistake in the video when I was talking, it's the same problem. But I think Leetcode may be dinging me for too many submissions. But I've made this video a couple times to hopefully get it right and to be concise and clear. So thank you very much for watching. I hope it helps.